My name is Aria Sullivan. I'm 30 years old, unmarried, and according to my family, that makes me a disgrace. They'd never use that exact word in front of me, of course. Too crude, too unpolished, but it drips from their smirks, their whispers, the way their eyes skim over me as if I'm some failed recipe they'd rather forget. But last month, during my cousin's extravagant wedding, the event my family had been waiting for, obsessing over, practically worshipping, I discovered something far more satisfying than a husband, the sweet taste of irony. It happened in the most glittering ballroom you can imagine, under chandeliers that rained light like liquid crystal, with tables groaning under towers of roses and champagne fountains. My family strutted about as if they owned the place. They didn't, but I did. That night, I became more than the outcast bride. I became the secret they never saw coming. Before I tell you how my family's whispers turned into stunned silence, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated by the people who should have cheered you on? Leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because nothing could have prepared them for the truth. Waiting at the altar of chandeliers and champagne, I wasn't always the woman who owned the ballroom floor. For most of my life, I was the girl seated at the far corner of the table, the one relatives pitied with tight smiles and clumsy questions. So, Aria, anyone special yet? If I dared to mention work, my hotel business, the career I poured myself into, they dismissed it with a shrug. That's nice, but don't you want a family? A family. As if the one I was born into hadn't already been enough to sour the word on my tongue. My cousin Vanessa was the jewel of the Sullivan clan. 3 years younger, prettier in that pageant doll way, spoiled with doting parents and endless praise. She had the kind of laugh that made people lean in, the kind of face that made people say yes before she even asked the question. At least, that's what everyone told her. When Vanessa got engaged, you'd think she had single-handedly secured peace on Earth. Announcements flew, champagne corks popped. My Aunt Margaret's voice carried across the neighborhood. Meanwhile, I was in the kitchen washing dishes beside my mother, listening to the celebration like a ghost overhearing the living. That's the way it always was. Vanessa in the spotlight, me in the shadows. She was the bride-to-be. I was the cautionary tale. And yet, this is where the irony takes root. While they were spending money they barely had on her fairy tale wedding, they were standing inside a fairy tale I had built brick by brick. The hotel. My hotel no one in the family knew. That wasn't by accident. I kept it quiet on purpose. A private rebellion. Let them think I had some little office job in the city. It amused me, the way they dismissed me with the same hands that clutched champagne glasses paid for by my empire. But before we get too far into secrets, you should know this. Owning a hotel doesn't erase scars. It doesn't silence the sting of Aunt Margaret's laughter when she says, "Poor Aria, she'll never know what real happiness feels like." Success doesn't shield you from the ache of wondering if, maybe, they're right. I still feel that ache sometimes. I felt it that night as I walked into the rehearsal dinner. Every eye flicked toward me, measuring, comparing, dismissing. They saw a single woman in a black dress. They didn't see the woman who had signed the staff checks that very morning. It's a funny thing, carrying a truth so large in silence. Like walking around with fireworks in your chest, waiting for the spark. And the spark did come. It wasn't in the way I expected. Not a speech, not a grand announcement. It came in a slip of words, a manager addressing me by title, right there in front of the family. A ripple moved across the room, whispers spreading like cracks in glass. That was the moment the chandelier light shifted, illuminating me for the first time not as their outcast, but as something else entirely. But I'm rushing ahead of myself. You'll want to know how it all began, how the ridicule piled up, how the wedding loomed like a storm cloud, how I kept my secret pressed tight to my ribs until it exploded in the most delicious way. You'll want to hear about Vanessa, my cousin the bride, with her lace gowns and glittering rings, who smiled at me with pity sharp enough to draw blood. You'll want to hear about Aunt Margaret, with her poisonous tongue, and my mother, too soft-spoken to defend me. And yes, you'll want to hear about the man who saw me, really saw me, when no one else bothered to look, so settle in. Because this isn't just a story about a wedding. It's about the moment an outcast bride learned that sometimes silence is the loudest revenge, and it begins with a dinner. Family gatherings were never quiet, even when they were supposed to be. In the Sullivan household, silence felt like failure, and noise felt like proof that you belonged. But belonging wasn't for me. Not really. Not in the way they measured it. Vanessa, of course, belonged effortlessly. She could sit at the head of the table in her Sunday dress, hands folded neatly, and my Aunt Margaret would gush about how graceful and accomplished she was. Every achievement, every compliment, every glittering fragment of attention was reserved for her. And me? I was the cautionary tale, the quiet one who read books while everyone clinked glasses, the daughter who preferred spreadsheets to gossip, the niece who spent summers working in hotels instead of attending debutante parties. At family dinners, I learned the fine art of smiling politely while being erased. I remember one particular dinner when I was 16. Vanessa had just won some small-town beauty pageant, and the family couldn't stop talking about her perfect posture, radiant smile, and how marriageable she was already. I had just received a scholarship to a prestigious hospitality program, a first in our extended family, but no one mentioned it. Margaret didn't glance at me once. My mother, Elaine, murmured something polite under her breath, but it was swallowed by the tide of praise for Vanessa. My Uncle Richard, ever the show-off, waved his wine glass and exclaimed, "Our little Vanessa is going places, eh? That's the way to make us proud." And there I sat, invisible. It wasn't that they didn't care exactly. Elaine loved me in her quiet, sidelong way. But love in the Sullivan family was measured by applause, and she rarely clapped for me. Margaret, sharp-tongued and relentless, thrived on comparisons, while Richard enjoyed the show, the spectacle of one niece shining while the other lurked in shadow. I learned early that being different was dangerous, that being smart or ambitious or independent didn't earn you praise. It earned whispers. Questions. Why can't she be more like Vanessa? Will she ever settle down? Those questions never left me, not even in my 20s. I threw myself into my work, building a career in hospitality because work never judged me. Work rewarded diligence, vision, and perseverance, qualities my family barely noticed. By the time I was 26, I was managing a small boutique hotel. By 28, I had invested in my first property. By 30, I owned a chain of luxury hotels in Boston. Yet the scars of past rejection lingered. Not all wounds can be stitched with money and success. Some sit under your skin, quietly pulsing whenever your family laughs at someone else's engagement announcement or compares your accomplishments to a distant standard of womanhood. I remember my heartbreak vividly. My first serious relationship in my mid-20s ended with the man leaving me for someone more suitable, as he politely phrased it. I was crushed, humiliated, convinced that even love had abandoned me because I didn't fit the mold. After months of crying into hotel floor tiles and business contracts, I decided that if the world wouldn't value me for my heart, I would make it impossible to ignore my mind. That's when I doubled down on my career. That's when I began building the life my family refused to see. I thought I had buried that pain, tucked it neatly behind job offers, signed contracts, and hotel renovations. I thought I had moved on entirely, and then the engagement announcement came. Not from a stranger, not from a colleague, but from Vanessa, my cousin. My mirror in their eyes of what a proper woman should be. It wasn't just any announcement. It was at a family brunch, orchestrated like a royal proclamation. Margaret beamed at her. Richard raised his glass. Elaine dabbed at her eyes with a linen napkin, muttering how proud she was. And me? I was expected to smile, to clap, to nod in approval while 1,000 unspoken comparisons pressed against my chest. While my heart tightened in old scars, while my stomach twisted at the memory of my own failed engagement, while every polite word I forced out tasted bitter. I thought I had mastered the art of control. I had learned to sit quietly, to nod, to smile, to watch from the sidelines. But as Vanessa's laughter echoed through the room, carrying the light, bright, perfect tones my family adored, I realized something. No matter how much success I had earned, no matter how much strength I had built in my own life, I was about to be reminded, loudly, publicly, of my place in the Sullivan hierarchy. And I knew, even then, that this was just the beginning. I thought I had buried that pain, until the engagement announcement came, in the most humiliating way possible. The day of the family dinner arrived like a storm I had no choice but to walk into. I dressed carefully, in a muted navy dress that was both professional and unobtrusive. The kind of outfit that said, "I'm here, but I won't compete." Vanessa, of course, wore something luminous, silk and shimmer, the kind of dress that demanded attention even before she spoke. Dinner was chaotic, as usual. Aunt Margaret arrived first, a flurry of pearls and perfume, immediately announcing that, tonight, we celebrate not just family, but the shining star of the evening. Her eyes flicked toward Vanessa with such pride it made my chest tighten. Richard, always eager to join in the fanfare, clinked his wine glass, a smug grin on his face as if he were the master of ceremonies. I took my seat quietly at the table's side, nodding politely to relatives I barely recognized, sipping water while they ordered champagne. Elaine, my mother, offered a small smile, but it felt fragile, like a candle flickering in a draft. Then Vanessa made her announcement. "My dearest family," she began, voice bright, sparkling. "I'm engaged." The room erupted in applause and cheers. Margaret clutched her pearls as if she were witnessing the coronation of a queen. "See, Aria," she said, leaning just slightly toward me, her voice dripping with superiority. "This is how a woman should live, not hiding behind work." I forced a polite smile. I nodded. I even murmured congratulations. But inside I was a storm. Anger, frustration, old heartbreak. They all swirled together, each emotion sharper than the last. Vanessa's fiancé, a handsome man named Philip, stood beside her, beaming, oblivious to the tension radiating from me. My family fawned over them, comparing their combined charm and elegance to my own solitude. The words were barely spoken, but they hit me like arrows. "Why can't you be more like her? Will you ever settle down?" I focused on the tablecloth, on the cutlery, anything but the piercing gaze of Margaret. I thought of the nights I spent building my career, the countless hours working my way through the hospitality industry, and how invisible it had made me in my own family's eyes. And then I noticed someone I hadn't seen in years. Daniel Hart. He was sitting across the room, a guest of a family friend, quietly observing the scene. Daniel, my childhood neighbor, had always had a keen eye, the kind that caught details others missed. He saw me, the tension behind my smile, the edge in my calm demeanor. Still the same Aria, I thought, recalling the boy who had once climbed the oak tree with me, sharing whispered secrets and daring adventures. He had grown into a tall, thoughtful man with easy charm, the kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself. But you noticed anyway? His gaze lingered on me, not with judgment, but with curiosity, recognition, and perhaps a touch of admiration. I swallowed a bitter laugh. Here they were, my family, in a frenzy over Vanessa's engagement, and he was noticing me, the Aria no one else seemed to see. For the first time in a long while, I felt a tiny flicker of comfort amid the humiliation. The conversation around the table continued, all about flowers, dresses, and the grandeur of the wedding that was already planned in meticulous detail. I nodded along when appropriate, said how lovely with practiced ease, all while my mind calculated, observed, and waited, even as they toasted Vanessa's future. I knew something they didn't, something that would change everything, something that had nothing to do with marriage, dresses, or approval. Something that made me almost giddy with anticipation despite the sting of their gloating. I allowed my eyes to drift to the window, catching the early evening light glinting off the city's skyline. My mind wandered to the past years, the relentless grind, the late nights at the hotel, the investment deals, the negotiations, the moments when I had been told I was dreaming too big. All of it had led here, to this room, filled with people who underestimated me at every turn. And yet, they had no idea that while Vanessa's engagement was their reason to cheer, I was already holding a trump card. A truth so sweet, so satisfying, it would make every insult, every overlooked achievement, every whispered comparison melt into silence. I leaned back in my chair, a polite smile on my face, feeling a calm resolve settle over me. I didn't need to speak yet. I didn't need to reveal anything, not now, but I savored the knowledge that soon, very soon, the balance of power would shift, and in that moment, Daniel's gaze met mine again, a subtle acknowledgement, a shared understanding that perhaps I wasn't entirely alone in the world. The evening progressed, with laughter, clinking glasses, and the usual flood of familial judgments. But for me, the world had shifted ever so slightly. A secret waited, tucked behind my quiet composure, ready to surface at the perfect time. Because the night was young, the champagne was flowing, and the truth, the delicious, ironical truth, was coming. And when it did, my family wouldn't know what hit them. A few weeks after the engagement announcement, the formal invitations arrived. I opened mine with the same calm detachment I had perfected over the years. Vanessa had hand-delivered it herself, a flourish of silk and perfume, a practiced smile on her lips. "Of course you'll come, even if it's hard for you," she said lightly, as if the words were a casual afterthought. Her tone was soft, almost playful, but there was an edge to it, a subtle jab that I had learned to recognize over a lifetime of family barbs. I smiled politely, the corners of my mouth twitching in barely contained amusement. "Wouldn't miss it," I said, voice steady. Inside, however, a quiet storm was brewing. I couldn't decide whether to laugh, sigh, or roll my eyes so hard I risked spraining something. But I settled on nothing at all, and slipped the invitation into my purse, where it would stay until the night of the wedding. The family, of course, had already begun their pre-wedding fanfare. Conversations at the dinner table that evening were dominated by discussions of gowns, flowers, and favors. Margaret, as usual, had taken charge. "We've booked the finest hotel in Boston," she said proudly, her voice carrying like a trumpet over the chatter. "The ballroom is exquisite, the catering unparalleled. Every guest will be talking about this wedding for years." Richard nodded, clinking his glass, and added, Yes, only the best for Vanessa. "You know, Aria, sometimes I wonder if you'd even recognize real luxury if it walked past you." I nodded politely again, taking a sip of water. Internally, I smirked. Luxury? Oh, I recognized it perfectly. More than they could possibly imagine. I had walked these hallways, inspected these chandeliers, and signed the contracts for the hotel months before. Every rose arrangement they would gush over, every crystal flute they would clink, my fingerprints were on them all. But I kept my silence. Why ruin the fun? The satisfaction of waiting, watching them flail in blissful ignorance, was far sweeter than any immediate victory. Vanessa leaned closer to Margaret, her voice just audible enough for me to hear. "Do you think Aria will even notice?" she asked, a small, mischievous smile playing on her lips. I clenched my jaw inside. Notice I noticed everything. Every whisper, every condescending glance, every carefully crafted compliment meant for someone else. But I had learned long ago that silence can be a more powerful weapon than words. Elaine, my mother, looked uncomfortable. She shifted in her seat, murmuring something about being proud of both daughters in her soft, hesitant voice. Margaret waved her off with a dismissive laugh. "Oh, Elaine, dear, we're just celebrating. Let's not pretend that one must compete with the other. Vanessa is the shining example tonight." And so it went. The family, intoxicated by the promise of the upcoming spectacle, continued their chatter, oblivious to the storm quietly gathering in me. Every boast about the hotel's grandeur, every mention of luxury and refinement made my smirk grow slightly. But outwardly, I remained the composed, obedient niece, sipping my drink, nodding, blending into the background, Daniel Hart, the childhood neighbor who had observed me so keenly at the engagement dinner, noticed something in my expression this time too. He raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at his lips, as if he could read the amusement simmering beneath my polite facade. For a fleeting moment, I felt a small thrill at the knowledge that someone besides me was beginning to sense there was more to Aria Sullivan than met the eye. The rest of the evening was filled with whispered plans, floral arrangements, and detailed seating charts. Vanessa's excitement was contagious, at least for everyone else. But it didn't touch me. I walked through the motions, nodding at suggestions, approving ideas with non-committal murmurs, while plotting silently in the back of my mind. And then came the thought that made my lips curl in near-invisible satisfaction. All their meticulous boasting about the finest hotel in Boston. Every gush, every sigh of wonder at the luxurious venue they were preparing to occupy. Little did they know, the venue they were bragging about was already mine. I let that thought linger in the back of my mind, letting it settle like a seed of anticipation. Soon, very soon, the day would arrive when every smile, every whispered insult, every condescending remark would be met with the quiet, undeniable power of truth. And I would be the one holding it. Until then, I would remain silent, polite, invisible, the perfect outcast. But the storm was coming, and nothing in the world could stop it from breaking. Most people, when they see me now, assume I've always had a comfortable life, that my world was paved with easy choices, plush carpets, and the soft hum of privilege. They're wrong. I didn't inherit anything but the very stubborn streak that keeps me moving forward, even when the world decides I'm invisible. I started young, with odd jobs at local hotels, washing dishes, folding linens, serving breakfast to sleepy guests while the city outside was still yawning awake. Nights were spent at my cramped apartment, textbooks and notebooks stacked high, the glow of my desk lamp painting my tired eyes in gold. Hospitality wasn't glamorous at first. It was exhausting, humbling, and relentless. But it taught me lessons that my family's praise never could: precision, patience, and the value of being unnoticed while building something extraordinary. By 23, I had secured my first small managerial position. I worked 12-hour days, learning every detail of the business, from reservations to revenue projections. I watched other managers come and go, many of them charming but careless, and quietly noted what I would do differently. Every mistake I witnessed became a stepping stone. Every success I achieved quietly, without applause, was stored in a private ledger of satisfaction no one else could see. I saved meticulously, investing in shares of boutique hotels whenever I could. People assumed I was just a careful saver, someone responsible but unremarkable. They didn't know that each share was a piece of a dream taking shape, a small rebellion against the expectations that tried to cage me. By 28, I had become the majority owner of a thriving hotel chain. My empire wasn't large yet, but it was mine. Entirely mine. Every chandelier, every marble countertop, every polished brass handle bore my fingerprints, figuratively and literally. And yet, in the eyes of my family, I was still that girl who hasn't settled down. Still invisible. Still the outcast. The only person who truly understood the weight of both worlds, the one that saw me as powerless, and the one that I had quietly built, was Sophia. She had been my hotel manager for 5 years, but more importantly, she was my confidant, my closest friend. She knew the nights I cried over unpaid bills, the moments I second-guessed myself, and the times I wanted to quit entirely. "Sophia," I said one late evening, leaning against the balcony of my newest property, "sometimes I wonder if all this matters. My family would never see it, never care. Maybe it's just vanity." She laughed, a soft, unwavering sound that cut through my self-doubt. "Aria, you built all of this, and the fact that your family is blind to it doesn't change a thing. They'll see eventually, or they won't, but what matters is that you know. And don't you forget it for a second." I wanted to argue, to say that it wasn't the same as recognition, that it still stung to have every accomplishment dismissed. But Sophia's eyes, steady and certain, left no room for compromise. Her words sank in like roots into fertile soil. I remembered every late-night meeting, every sleepless decision, every calculated risk I had taken. They were mine, every ounce of it. "You're right," I admitted softly. "I don't need them to notice." Sophia smiled, nudging me gently with her shoulder. "Good, because when they finally find out, Aria—" She paused, letting her words hang like a promise. Oh, how sweet it will be. I let myself imagine it. The scene at the wedding, my family marveling at the hotel's grandeur, thinking it was someone else's achievement, only to realize the truth. Every insult, every whispered comparison, every eye roll over my supposed failures, washed away in the brilliance of their stunned silence. I smiled to myself. I had waited patiently, quietly, letting them parade their assumptions. And now, the culmination of years of sweat and determination was about to speak for me in a language my family couldn't ignore. I never needed their validation. But oh, how sweet it would be when the truth slipped out. And as I looked over the city skyline from my balcony, the lights of Boston sparkling like scattered diamonds, I allowed myself a small thrill. The wedding was approaching. The family was busy boasting about the finest hotel in Boston without realizing whose name was on every permit, every contract, every reservation. I closed my eyes and breathed in deeply, savoring the quiet anticipation, the tiny heartbeat of triumph that had been mine all along. In a few days, the world, or at least my family, would finally know. And until that moment, I could relish in the secret. My private victory. My invisible crown. The outcast was about to become the only person standing at the center of attention. Vanessa's bridal shower was a pastel nightmare of tulle, scented candles, and table settings that practically demanded a photograph for Instagram. I walked in, trying to appear cheerful, while silently noting that every ribbon, every centerpiece, and every glittering favor was more expensive than my entire apartment had cost 5 years ago. Family members hovered in small groups, whispering, laughing, and occasionally glancing in my direction. Still single, aren't you? I overheard Margaret ask one of her friends, her tone casual, almost playful, but the venom underneath was unmistakable. I smiled politely, acknowledging nothing, while my stomach twisted with a mix of irritation and old hurt. Vanessa, radiant as ever, moved through the room like a butterfly, doling out favors to each guest. Silver-trimmed candles, monogrammed tote bags, gourmet chocolates wrapped in silk. Every detail screamed luxury. Every gesture was calculated, intentional, proof that her life was picture-perfect. I had brought my own gift for the attendees, a small but thoughtful token, personalized notebooks I had commissioned from a local artist, each embossed with subtle initials. Practical, unique, something that would last beyond the day's celebration. But as the guests unwrapped them, polite smiles barely masked their confusion. "Oh, how interesting," one whispered to another, frowning slightly at the understated elegance. Vanessa's guests, accustomed to grandeur and flash, didn't quite know what to do with subtlety. I felt the familiar sting of being overlooked, of having my intentions dismissed. Yet I kept my composure, smiling quietly, tucking my disappointment away where no one could see it. Then Daniel appeared. Out of nowhere, he was standing near the refreshment table, his expression casual but attentive. He leaned slightly toward me, his voice soft but carrying just enough warmth to cut through the social chaos. "You're still impressively calm," he said, nodding toward the swirl of glitter and chatter. "Most people would have lost their patience by now." I laughed softly, a sound I rarely allowed in front of the family. "I've had a lot of practice," I said, letting my eyes drift over the pastel decorations. "They've been judging me for years." Daniel's smile widened, and I noticed it wasn't mocking or condescending. There was genuine admiration in his gaze. "Well, if that's true, then you've earned the right to stand back and watch. Sometimes patience pays off more than trying to fight for attention." I nodded, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time, someone outside my family noticing, recognizing, and maybe even understanding me. I allowed myself a fleeting sense of comfort, just long enough to steady my nerves before the next wave of familial judgment hit. Margaret, naturally, was not content to leave well enough alone. She circled the room like a hawk, sniffing out anyone who dared to smile without her permission. At one point, she stopped near my table, lips curling into that familiar half-smile that was anything but friendly. "And what about you, Aria?" she asked, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, as if the spotlight had to swing to me. "Still working too hard to find someone to keep you company? Or are you planning to stay alone forever, just hiding behind your projects?" The words stung in a way that made my teeth clench. My hands tightened around my gift, the leather edges pressing into my palms. I forced a polite nod, my lips tight. Inside, the familiar storm was rising, the frustration, the anger, the memories of years of dismissal, of being overlooked and undervalued. Vanessa glanced at me, a small, uncomfortable smile crossing her face. She clearly hadn't meant it maliciously, but she couldn't understand why Margaret's words cut so sharply. Margaret, of course, basked in the moment, enjoying the discomfort she had so carefully orchestrated. I thought of walking out then, storming from the room with my dignity intact, letting them stew in the discomfort they had inflicted. I pictured the shocked looks, the whispered apologies they'd never actually voice. But I didn't. Not yet, because I knew something they didn't, something that would tip the scales entirely. And I was savoring the anticipation, letting the silent power of it simmer in the back of my mind. The room continued its swirl of perfume, pastels, and polite applause. But in my mind, the future was vivid, my secret, my carefully constructed empire, waiting to turn the tables on the very people who had dismissed me for years. And then Aunt Margaret asked the question that nearly made me walk out for good. I had been bracing myself for Margaret's inevitable intrusion all evening, and yet when it came, it hit like a thunderclap. "Aria," she called, her voice loud enough to slice through the soft hum of conversation and music. "When will it be your turn? Or are you too busy pretending to be important at that job of yours?" The words landed with the subtlety of a brick through a window. Heads turned. Vanessa froze mid-laugh, a delicate fork poised in her hand. Guests nearby glanced between us, sensing the tension radiating from every syllable Margaret spat. I felt my cheeks warm, my pulse quicken, but I refused to let her see the storm behind my calm facade. I had faced this my entire life. The comparisons, the questions, the sneers that masqueraded as casual concern. Every insult was familiar, like an old bruise that throbbed just beneath the surface. I swallowed. Slowly, deliberately. My voice remained even, polished, neutral, everything Margaret would expect. "Thank you for your concern, Aunt Margaret," I said, my tone polite, measured. "I'm very focused on my work right now, and it's going well." I let the words hang in the air, perfectly tame, perfectly underwhelming to her. Inside, however, my mind was already racing. "You'll know soon enough," I thought, tasting the sweetness of delayed satisfaction. "Patience, Aria. Just a little longer." The moment stretched, a fragile bubble of polite civility, and Margaret, sensing she had poked the bear, narrowed her eyes slightly. She didn't press further, but her expression promised she would return. She always returned. I shifted my attention to Vanessa, who had given me a sympathetic look, perhaps unsure whether to intervene or enjoy the spectacle. But Vanessa was blissfully unaware of the power simmering beneath my composed exterior. She thought I was meek, quiet, and entirely incapable of commanding attention. That was precisely why I had chosen to remain silent. Silence, after all, is a weapon far sharper than confrontation. It allows your opponent to underestimate you, to make assumptions that you can later twist into triumph. As Margaret drifted back into a cluster of gossiping guests, I allowed myself a moment to think strategically. Could I reveal my ownership of the hotel now? The thought was delicious. Seeing the shock, the sudden faltering of smirks, the disbelief that I could hold power where they thought I had none. Every insult they had thrown at me would ricochet right back. But no, not yet. Timing was everything. A premature reveal could lessen the impact, dilute the satisfaction. My family thrived on assumptions and judgment. My quiet, methodical patience would let the truth strike with maximum effect. I pictured the wedding day, the chandeliers reflecting off crystal glasses, the lush arrangements, the guests murmuring in awe at the beauty of the hotel. And there I would be, standing quietly in plain sight, letting them marvel at the grandeur without realizing whose vision had created it. My empire, built in silence, would finally demand recognition in the most elegant, undeniable way. Daniel, standing across the room, caught my eye for a brief second. There was a knowing glint there, something that hinted he had begun to notice, to appreciate the subtle power I carried. His presence, calm and observant, reminded me that acknowledgement didn't need to come from my family alone. It could come from someone who understood, not someone blinded by tradition or prejudice. Margaret, oblivious to the depth of my thoughts, continued her parade of judgment in hushed tones, her voice floating to me like a persistent wind. When will she realize her place? When will she stop hiding behind work? I smiled faintly, a secret smile. Hiding behind work, perhaps. But it was no longer hiding. It was building, strategizing, preparing. Every late night, every difficult decision, every risk I had taken had brought me to this precise point. Patience, Aria. Just a little longer. They'll choke on their words soon enough. I let my gaze wander over the room, noting the tiny cracks in their composure, the subtle tension in Vanessa's posture, the whispered reassurances between my relatives. I felt a thrill I hadn't felt in years, the quiet anticipation of the moment when truth would finally rise above the noise of judgment and expectation. I would wait. I would let the moment mature like fine wine. And when it came, when the curtain lifted, every word Margaret had ever spoken, every comparison, every whisper of disappointment, would be met with the only thing that could silence her. Undeniable, exquisite truth. I straightened my posture, letting the calm confidence settle over me. My exterior was polished, serene, unshakable. Inside, however, a quiet fire burned, fueled by every slight, every oversight, every underestimation I had endured. Margaret had asked her question. I had answered politely, with nothing more than words. But the real answer, the one that mattered, would be revealed in time. And I could hardly wait for that moment. Because victory, when it comes quietly and deliberately, tastes infinitely sweeter than any immediate retaliation. The evening of the rehearsal dinner arrived, and the hotel staff moved like a well-oiled machine, anticipating every need, every request. I lingered at the edge of the room, a silent observer, watching as guests arrived in waves, laughing, chatting, and marveling at the space around them. Every crystal chandelier, polished marble surface, and velvet-draped chair gleamed under the soft glow of carefully orchestrated lighting. I could hear the murmurs immediately. "It's magnificent," one aunt whispered. "Absolutely exquisite. Whoever owns this must have an impeccable eye for detail." Another cousin leaned closer to her companion, eyes wide. "Can you imagine the wealth it takes to manage such a property?" "I've never seen anything like it." I stood quietly, a faint smile tugging at my lips, savoring each comment. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were praising the hotel's elegance, talking about its brilliant ownership, and not a single one had a clue that the woman they had spent years dismissing, the single, career-obsessed Aria, was the mind behind it all. Sophia, my trusted manager and closest friend, moved beside me checking the arrangements, making sure everything ran flawlessly. She caught my eye briefly and I saw her lips twitch in a subtle grin. She knew. She always knew. "Miss Sullivan," she began, almost whispering as she passed by. "The tables. Every detail looks perfect." I raised a brow at her, appreciating the slip of formality, and subtly reminded her with a small shake of my head, "Careful, Sophia." "Not yet." She blinked, cheeks flushing faintly, and nodded, tightening her smile as she moved along. One word, too many, one slip, and the secret would burst wide open. Throughout the evening, my family moved through the space with the same obliviousness they had always carried. Vanessa floated from group to group, dressed in her gown that sparkled with sequins, perfectly rehearsed smiles plastered on her face. Margaret, of course, was in her element, eyes scanning the room as if to catalog everyone's reactions, her voice dripping with the usual superiority. Richard was busy making a spectacle of himself, clinking glasses, joking, and complimenting the hotel's elegance with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Absolutely brilliant," he said, leaning toward Vanessa. "The owners must be geniuses to pull off such perfection. Imagine the vision required." I pressed my lips together to keep from smiling too widely. They had no idea. The hotel wasn't the work of some unknown benefactor. It was mine. Every glittering corner, every polished surface, every meticulously chosen detail had my signature touch, and they were standing right inside it, blind to the truth, gushing over accomplishments that belonged to me. Daniel Hart, ever observant, arrived quietly behind the crowd, his eyes immediately finding mine. He raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk playing at his lips, and I felt a small surge of satisfaction. He had been seeing more than my family ever did. The spark in his gaze was one of admiration, silent, understated, and entirely genuine. The staff moved around the room with careful precision, whispering amongst themselves, exchanging glances that carried respect and deference. A few of the newer hires glanced in my direction, nodding subtly, recognizing the authority I wielded even without a single announcement. Sophia, always careful, stayed close, checking details, smoothing arrangements, adjusting lighting. I watched her carefully, noting the subtle tension in her movements, the way her words almost betrayed the truth. I had trained her well, professionalism first, loyalty second, and secrecy always. Yet in the momentary slip, the word owner almost escaped. It hovered on her lips, a fragile bubble threatening to burst. And I thought, just for a fleeting second, of how satisfying it would be if the secret revealed itself now, spontaneously like a spark setting off fireworks. My family's expressions, their wide eyes, their mouths half open in shock, would be worth more than 1,000 polite nods or forced congratulations. But patience, I reminded myself. Timing was everything. The wedding day, not tonight, would be the stage for the grand revelation. Tonight was merely the appetizer, a quiet glimpse of the power they were about to realize. One word too many, and the secret would burst wide open. I moved to the edge of the balcony for a brief moment, letting my eyes sweep over the hotel that I had built with my own hands. The marble, the lighting, the subtle elegance of the floral arrangements, everything reflected years of hard work, determination, and careful planning. And soon, my family would have to face the truth. Until then, I would watch, wait, and savor the anticipation. They had no idea who they were standing next to, who had provided the brilliance behind every glittering detail. And that, above all else, was mine to enjoy. The day before the wedding, the hotel pulsed with activity. Staff scurried about, arranging flowers, polishing silver, and adjusting linens. I watched from the edge of the chaos, clipboard in hand, a silent observer in the empire I had built. My family, of course, had no idea whose domain this was. Vanessa, however, was not enjoying herself. The sparkling facade of the perfect bride was starting to crack. Her hands trembled slightly as she fussed over table settings, checked the placement of chairs, and barked at staff in a tone sharper than I had ever heard from her before. I tried to stay out of her way, focusing on the final details. But Margaret, sensing an opportunity to stir the pot, leaned over Vanessa and whispered something with a sly smile. Vanessa's eyes flicked toward me, and without thinking, she snapped, "Aria, would you just stand over there quietly and not make things worse?" Her words, casual but cutting, stung in that familiar way, the way they always did when she thought she could remind me of my place. I clenched my jaw and forced a polite nod, letting the words slide over me. Inside, though, the old familiar fire ignited. Not long now. Not long at all. Daniel, who had been quietly observing from the side, stepped closer. He didn't speak at first, simply letting his presence be a shield, a reminder that someone besides my family could see me. "You handled that well," he said softly, his voice low enough for only me to hear. I'd have lost my patience 10 times over. I let out a small, humorless laugh. "Years of practice," I whispered back. He smiled, an easy, genuine curve of lips that made the tension in my shoulders ease slightly. "It's more than practice. You have a quiet strength. Not many people notice it, but I do." His words made my chest tighten, not with the familiar ache of disappointment or comparison, but something warmer, softer. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as a failure, not as a bride-to-be's shadow, but as myself. Vanessa, meanwhile, continued to pace, muttering complaints under her breath. She fretted over floral arrangements, the precise alignment of chairs, even the angles of lighting for photographs. Margaret hovered nearby, offering thinly veiled advice, while Richard busied himself charming guests who were beginning to notice the sheer scale and beauty of the venue. I watched it all with a detached amusement. They had no idea that everything Vanessa was obsessing over, every glittering centerpiece and meticulous detail, was mine. My work, my vision, my empire quietly flexing its muscles under the guise of someone else's celebration. Yet there was a small part of me that felt almost protective toward Vanessa in that moment. She was tense, vulnerable, and entirely unaware of the storm that awaited her and the rest of the family. For all her flaws and the lifetime of comparisons, she was still my cousin, still part of the family that had dismissed me for years. Daniel stepped closer again, his hand brushing lightly against mine in a gesture of reassurance. "You'll get your moment," he said, his eyes flicking toward the bustling room. "I can't wait to see their faces when it finally sinks in." I smiled, letting the anticipation settle like a warm weight in my chest. "Patience," I murmured almost to myself. "Just a little longer." The room's tension was palpable. Staff moved with precision, guests murmured compliments, and my family remained blissfully ignorant of whose hands had orchestrated every detail. Even Vanessa, in her panic over perfection, had no inkling that her carefully curated celebration was taking place in the domain of the one person they had collectively underestimated for decades. As I stood there, Daniel's quiet presence grounding me, I realized that the hardest part of my life, the endless comparisons, the whispered criticisms, the expectation that I would always remain invisible, was about to shift. The stage was set. The curtain was about to lift, and for the first time, I allowed myself to feel a quiet triumph. Not over Vanessa, not over Margaret, not over the family that had spent years measuring my worth against an arbitrary standard of womanhood, but over the certainty that my moment, my recognition, was imminent. I glanced at Daniel again, catching the faint spark of admiration in his eyes, and allowed myself a private smile. He didn't see me as a shadow or a failure or a mere observer. He saw me, and in that recognition, I found a strength I hadn't realized I'd been carrying all along. The cracks in Vanessa's facade were widening, the hotel hummed with anticipation, and the family remained oblivious to the truth. Patience, Aria. Just a little longer. They'll choke on their words soon enough. The wedding day arrived in a flurry of silk, lace, and impossible perfection. The sun reflected off the hotel's glass facade, casting glimmers of light that danced across the marble floors. Every detail had been executed flawlessly. Flawless, that is, by my hand. Every chair aligned, every flower placed, every menu printed with precision. Family members bustled about. obsessing over appearances, adjusting dresses, fussing with hair and jewelry, and reminding one another to smile for the photographers. Margaret flitted through the crowd like a hawk, scanning for any flaw she could critique, while Richard clinked glasses with various aunts and uncles, narrating exaggerated tales of generosity and family pride. Vanessa floated like a fragile porcelain doll, her laughter practiced, her steps measured, all in the service of maintaining the illusion of a perfect bride. Guests began to arrive in waves, murmuring compliments and exchanging gossip like currency. The air buzzed with excitement, anticipation, and the faint undercurrent of competition that always followed a Sullivan family event. I observed quietly, clipboard in hand, moving discreetly from corner to corner, adjusting a napkin here, straightening a centerpiece there, all while remaining invisible to those who had always assumed I had no power, no influence, no presence worth noticing. And then I heard it. A group of my relatives huddled near the grand staircase, whispering just loud enough to carry across the polished floor. "Poor Aria," one aunt murmured, the words dipped in pity. "She'll never know this kind of joy. Always working, always alone. It must be hard." I stifled a laugh, keeping my expression calm. Poor Aria. The irony was delicious. If only they knew the joy of watching arrogance crumble, of witnessing their assumptions unravel under the weight of undeniable truth. Margaret's sharp eyes swept the room, hunting for anyone who dared breach the social order she had so carefully curated. She didn't notice me as I moved past her, making subtle adjustments, directing staff, and overseeing every detail. Not a single thought crossed her mind that the quiet, single Aria she had dismissed all these years was, in fact, the orchestrator of the very wedding she was praising. Daniel arrived shortly after the first guests, his presence calm, almost grounding. He caught my eye as I passed, a subtle nod of recognition. He didn't need words. The spark in his gaze told me he understood. I allowed myself a fleeting smile, a private acknowledgement that someone had been quietly watching, admiring, and perhaps even rooting for me long before my family realized my worth. Vanessa's nerves were palpable. She flitted from table to table, adjusting silverware, straightening chairs, and fretting over the floral arrangements. Her laughter, though bright, had a brittle edge. Every time she passed near me, I could feel her tension, her desperation to maintain perfection in a world she didn't control. Margaret hovered behind her like a specter, offering critiques in hushed tones, her words meant to undermine rather than guide. Richard, ever the showman, delivered compliments to guests about the brilliant owners of the hotel, none of whom could possibly be me in their minds. I moved silently through the room, overseeing the staff, giving the occasional nod or whispered instruction. Every detail reflected my work, my vision, my dedication. And yet my family remained blind to it, oblivious to the truth that the luxury, the elegance, and the flawless execution of the day were all mine. The guests continued to murmur, complimenting everything from the crystal chandeliers to the floral arrangements, and I listened, savoring each comment. The thrill of silent power coursed through me. My family's obsession with appearances had always been my cage, but today, that very obsession would be the instrument of their astonishment. Daniel lingered near me, subtly offering reassurance. "It's beautiful," he said softly, his voice just above a whisper. "Every detail perfect." "Yes," I murmured, letting a trace of pride edge my tone. "Every detail." As the final preparations concluded, I allowed myself a private glance over the room. The hotel gleamed with opulence, the staff moved seamlessly, and the guests remained blissfully unaware that the brilliance they were enjoying was entirely mine. And then I thought, with a thrill I could hardly contain, the moment was approaching. Soon they would learn what I had known all along, that power and recognition do not always arrive through applause or approval, but through patience, perseverance, and quiet mastery. If only they knew the joy of watching arrogance crumble. The reception had begun, and the hotel was alive with laughter, clinking glasses, and the low hum of conversation. Everything was perfect, or at least as perfect as my carefully orchestrated plans had allowed. I moved through the room, checking details subtly, ensuring the staff was in place, the lighting softened just enough, and the floral arrangements maintained their elegance. Sophia, my trusted manager, approached me, a clipboard in hand. She whispered something low enough for only me to hear about minor adjustments to table settings and beverage service. I nodded, ready to respond, but then something unexpected happened. Margaret and a few other relatives had drifted close, curious about the whispered conversation. I kept my tone calm, professional, and casual, but intentionally loud enough for them to catch fragments. "Yes, Sophia, let's adjust the tables here and the linens there," I said smoothly, scanning the room with a practiced eye. Sophia paused, glancing at me with a barely perceptible grin, then nodded. "Of course, Ms. Sullivan. Thank you for allowing us to host your family's event in your hotel." The words hit the room like a silent explosion. I felt Margaret's eyes narrow, her jaw tightening in confusion. Vanessa froze mid-step, her perfect smile faltering. A murmur rippled across the crowd, faint at first, then growing steadily louder. "She owns this? Wait, Aria owns the hotel? She's been managing this whole time?" My pulse quickened, but I maintained the calm exterior I had perfected over decades. My family was finally beginning to catch up to the truth. Their assumptions, their dismissals, their condescending remarks, all of it had led to this moment. I allowed myself a private smile. Their disbelief, the slow dawning realization that the quiet, single Aria had been the architect of every sparkling detail around them, was intoxicating. Vanessa's face turned pale, and she glanced at Margaret, as if pleading silently for an explanation. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, then paused, realizing perhaps for the first time that she had no words strong enough to challenge what she now understood. Richard's eyes widened, and he turned to a nearby cousin, whispering frantically, She owns the hotel? All of it?" Daniel, standing at my side, allowed a subtle smile to play across his lips. His gaze met mine, and for a moment, the world outside this revelation didn't exist. He had seen my strength, my independence, long before anyone else had, and now the universe, the one constructed by my family's assumptions, was finally catching up. Sophia gave a subtle nod, signaling that the adjustments were complete, and then stepped back gracefully, leaving me in the center of attention without a word more. The room's atmosphere had shifted completely. The polite chatter had turned to hushed whispers. Guests who had once looked at me with mild pity now regarded me with curiosity, admiration, and a touch of awe. I could feel it, the energy, the subtle tremor in the air, as recognition finally landed where it had long been overdue. I allowed my gaze to travel across the room. Margaret, frozen mid-step, seemed to be searching for a rebuttal, but no words came. Vanessa, her composure cracked, clutched her bouquet tightly, unsure how to process the revelation. Even Richard, forever confident, looked as though he had been temporarily unmoored from the pedestal he had always occupied in his own mind. And through it all, I remained composed, calm, elegant. The woman they had dismissed, underestimated, and whispered about behind closed doors had always held the power. Now, they were witnessing it firsthand. I took a slow breath, savoring the moment. The culmination of years of work, quiet determination, and patience had finally crystallized. This was the triumph I had envisioned every time my family had belittled me, every time they had whispered that I was still single or too busy with work. The whispers continued, spreading like wildfire. "She planned all this. She owns the hotel. I can't believe we never noticed." And then, as if the universe itself had paused to savor the irony, the room froze, all eyes turned to me for a heartbeat. The room was silent, every gaze fixed, every whisper halted. All attention focused entirely on the woman they had assumed to be insignificant. The thrill of the moment surged through me, warm and sharp and utterly satisfying. This was the apex of patience, the perfect orchestration of quiet triumph. Their astonishment, their belated recognition, and the sheer disbelief were mine to witness, untainted by argument or confrontation. It was glorious, and in that suspended silence I felt the weight of years lift. The outcast had finally claimed her stage, and nothing would ever allow them to forget it. The silence in the room was deafening. Every whispered conversation had died mid-sentence. Every glass held mid-air. The attention of over 100 guests was suddenly, inexplicably, mine. The realization had spread like wildfire. The woman they had dismissed, the outcast, the one quietly sitting in the background, had been the mastermind behind every gleaming detail of the wedding. Margaret was the first to break the spell, though barely. Her sharp eyes, usually filled with confidence and condescension, widened in disbelief. She took a small step forward, her voice trembling slightly, betraying the panic she tried to mask. Is that true?" She asked, each word deliberate, heavy with incredulity. You own this. This entire hotel? I nodded slowly, deliberately, savoring the rising tension. My voice was calm, measured, the epitome of composure. Yes, St. Margaret, I do. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt, as if gravity had shifted. Margaret's lips parted, her words trapped somewhere between disbelief and indignation. Vanessa, standing beside her, stiffened, her smile faltering. She had never considered that the quiet, unmarried cousin she had been groomed to outshine could command such authority, such undeniable success. Richard's jaw tightened, and he glanced nervously around the room, as if seeking reassurance from anyone but me. He found none. The shock was universal, a wave sweeping through every relative, every guest. Murmurs began to rise, half astonishment, half shame. She's been managing all of this? Someone whispered, voice tinged with awe. And we never noticed? Another added, incredulity cracking through their tone. I allowed the murmurs to wash over me, letting the tension stretch, letting the disbelief grow. This was my moment, the culmination of years of being underestimated, dismissed, and patronized. And now I would speak. Margaret, recovering just enough to try and reclaim authority, opened her mouth. I held up a hand, a subtle gesture that silenced her almost instantly. My gaze swept over the family, steady and unwavering. Let me make one thing clear, I said, my tone calm but firm. Marriage isn't the only measure of a woman's worth, nor is the approval of those who choose to underestimate her. A stunned silence followed, broken only by the soft clink of glasses and the faint rustle of clothing as relatives shifted uneasily. Margaret's mouth opened again, searching for some retort, but nothing came. She had no comeback. Vanessa, ever poised, attempted a tight-lipped smile, but the jealousy lurking beneath her surface betrayed her. She adjusted her bouquet nervously, her carefully cultivated air of perfection faltering in the face of the truth. I could see the conflict in her eyes, between admiration she didn't want to admit and the sting of realization. That she had been outshined in a domain she had assumed was outside my reach. I let my gaze linger on the room, noting the shifts in posture, the furrowed brows, the stunned expressions, my family's obsession with appearances, their whispered comparisons, and their constant judgments had finally collided with reality. And reality had me at its center. Daniel, standing at my side, gave a subtle, approving nod. His eyes carried admiration, respect, and something warmer, a quiet acknowledgement of the person I had always been beyond the family's narrow definitions. I allowed myself a private smile in return, letting the brief warmth of recognition from someone who truly saw me balance the tension radiating from my relatives. Margaret, finally finding her voice, tried again, though it lacked its usual bite. But you're still single. How could this not? I cut her off with a steady gaze, my voice unwavering. Being single does not diminish my accomplishments, nor does it make me any less capable or worthy of respect. I have built something meaningful, something tangible, and it stands as proof of what I'm capable of, independent of anyone else's approval. There was a palpable pause. Margaret's face paled slightly. Vanessa's shoulders slumped, and Richard's usual confident smirk had vanished entirely. Even the extended family, who had gathered to celebrate Vanessa's wedding, seemed momentarily humbled by the assertion of competence and self-worth displayed so effortlessly by the woman they had long overlooked. He allowed the silence to linger a little longer, savoring it, letting the gravity of my words settle across the room. My victory wasn't loud, nor was it destructive. It was poised, elegant, undeniable. Margaret tried again, but even she seemed to realize there was no path forward. No words could diminish what had just been revealed. No dismissive comment could erase the truth that I had been the architect of everything they had celebrated that evening. For once, they had no comeback. I allowed a small, private smile to curl at my lips. The satisfaction of years spent working, enduring, and waiting for this exact moment coursed through me. The outcast, underestimated for decades, now stood firmly at the center of attention, not because of a marriage, not because of conformity, but because of her accomplishments, her vision, and her unshakable determination. Vanessa approached, hesitating, her gaze flicking nervously from me to the space around us. She finally managed a strained smile, murmuring, I didn't realize. You did all this. I inclined my head slightly, with a gentle grace that carried no malice, only quiet confidence. Now you do. The room absorbed the truth. slowly, awkwardly, and yet with a grudging recognition. My family's obsession with appearances, their petty judgments, and whispered comparisons had finally met the force of reality. And that force was me, Aria Sullivan, unmarried, underestimated, and utterly unstoppable. For once, they had no comeback. The room had shifted. What had started as a typical family wedding, with all its gossip, judgment, and silent competitions, had transformed into something entirely different. Conversations moved in hushed tones, punctuated by whispers of admiration. Guests who had been oblivious minutes ago now regarded me with a new lens, as if they had just discovered a previously hidden layer of brilliance. I moved through the room almost invisibly, feeling the weight of their attention. Margaret hovered awkwardly near a table, her earlier confidence dissolved into something like stunned disbelief. Vanessa's perfect posture had softened, a subtle tension etched across her face as she navigated the realization that the cousin she had long assumed, inferior, had quietly outshone her in every imaginable way. Richard's showy bravado had vanished entirely, replaced by a quiet, almost helpless awe. And my extended family, who had once whispered about my supposed shortcomings, now looked at me with tentative respect, curiosity, and perhaps a touch of guilt for underestimating me. I paused near the balcony, letting the energy wash over me. Every element of this day, the flowers, the lighting, the flawless execution, reflected years of careful planning, hard work, and quiet determination. All of it had culminated in this moment of perfect irony. The outcast, dismissed for years, now quietly commanding the attention of everyone who had ever doubted her. Daniel appeared beside me almost silently, his presence grounding me amidst the storm of attention. "Impressive," he said, his voice low, carrying genuine admiration. I've watched a lot of weddings, and very few have this level of precision and grace. You orchestrated all of this without a single person realizing it was you. I allowed myself a small smile, letting a flicker of warmth reach my eyes. "Years of practice," I said lightly, though my voice carried the satisfaction of long-awaited recognition. He nodded, a grin tugging at his lips. "You deserve the credit. And if you'll let me, I'd like to walk you out of here. After all, you've earned a proper moment of celebration." His offer surprised me, in a good way. For so long I had felt isolated, dismissed, and unseen. Now, someone outside my family, someone who genuinely understood and appreciated my strength, was offering companionship, not pity, not judgment, but genuine connection. Before I could answer, I felt a familiar presence behind me. My mother, Elaine, who had always been passive, had watched the entire evening with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. She approached quietly, her steps tentative, eyes flicking briefly toward my family before meeting mine. "Aria," she whispered, her voice soft and warm. I'm proud of you." The words struck me in a way nothing else could. A mother's quiet pride, finally given, free of judgment or expectation, anchored me in a way I hadn't anticipated. Without another word, she pulled me into a gentle hug, and I felt the subtle release of years of tension, the unspoken acknowledgement of my worth finally expressed. I held her for a moment longer than I might have allowed before, savoring the warmth, the validation, the recognition that even my family, some of them, at least, could see me as I truly was. Not a failure, not an afterthought, not a shadow of someone else's achievements, but Aria Sullivan, whole, capable, and undeniable. Pulling back slightly, I allowed myself a glance around the room. Guests still whispered softly, eyes flicking to me with admiration. The staff, poised and professional, carried themselves with a quiet deference, aware of the truth, yet honoring the moment with discretion. Even Margaret, still standing stiffly near the punch table, could no longer mask the mixture of disbelief and respect in her expression. Vanessa had recovered some of her composure, offering me a strained, polite smile. I returned it gracefully, letting her know that the past comparisons no longer held power over me. She had her moment, I had mine. And now the scales had finally shifted, just slightly, toward equilibrium. Daniel stepped closer again, extending his arm in a silent, gentlemanly offer. I allowed a faint smile to curve my lips and took it. We moved toward the balcony doors together, leaving the room behind, a soft murmur of whispered recognition following us as we stepped into the evening air. The cool breeze felt like a release, a gentle exhale after the tension of years, decades even, of being underestimated. I inhaled deeply, letting the scent of the city and the faint aroma of flowers fill my senses. For the first time, I felt the kind of quiet triumph that didn't need fanfare, applause, or validation from anyone else. Daniel looked at me, his expression soft but intentional. "You handled everything beautifully. Truly, you've earned this." I let a private, secretive smile curl at my lips. "I suppose I have," I said, almost to myself, though loud enough for him to hear. As we stood together, looking back toward the hotel, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. A sense of connection, of possibility, of being seen, not just by someone outside my family, but perhaps even by the people who had dismissed me for so long. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I thought. The hotel gleamed behind us, a silent monument to years of perseverance, patience, and quiet strength. My family had finally witnessed my truth, and somewhere in that quiet victory, I allowed myself to imagine a future where my accomplishments were celebrated, not mocked, diminished, or overlooked. For now, though, I simply breathed, feeling the thrill of long-awaited recognition, the warmth of genuine admiration, and the subtle, intoxicating joy of finally standing in my own light. The night was winding down. The laughter, clinking glasses, and soft music drifted through the hotel like the remnants of a dream. Guests lingered, savoring the final moments of celebration, but I knew it was time to leave. My heels clicked lightly against the polished marble as I made my way toward the exit, moving with a quiet confidence I had carried only in my own mind until now. I paused at the door, glancing back at the grand ballroom one last time. The chandeliers sparkled brilliantly, reflecting the soft glow of candlelight off the meticulously arranged tables. The flowers, the linens, the elegance of every detail. It was all mine. Every inch of this night, once meant to showcase someone else's perfection, now stood as a testament to my years of persistence, patience, and unrecognized effort. My family was still inside, talking in hushed tones, their attention slowly shifting from Vanessa to the realization that I had quietly orchestrated everything. Margaret's sharp expressions had softened into a reluctant acknowledgement, Vanessa's flawless smile now tinged with awareness, and even Richard seemed momentarily lost in thought. For all their noise, their judgment, and their constant comparison, I walked away unshaken, head high, quietly savoring my triumph. Outside, the cool night air wrapped around me like a cloak, offering a sense of liberation I hadn't realized I craved. The streets were calm, the city lights twinkling softly in the distance. I exhaled deeply, letting the tension of years, of whispers, dismissals, and silent criticisms finally release itself. I reflected on my journey, tracing it from the earliest moments of rejection to the quiet victories I had built on my own. Every "you'll never" and "she's too much" had fueled my determination. Every lonely night spent working, planning, and learning had strengthened me, honing skills and resilience that no approval could ever give. Success, I realized, had never come from them. It had always come from me. Even the heartbreaks, the engagements that ended, the disappointments that stung so sharply in my mid-20s, now seemed like necessary steps. Each moment of isolation had shaped me, carved me into someone capable of more than my family had ever imagined. The outcast, the overlooked, the woman dismissed because she did not follow their narrow vision of perfection. She was finally standing on a pedestal of her own making. I allowed myself a small, private smile. They had called me the outcast bride, ridiculed me for being unmarried, and assumed my life was lacking. But that day, I had learned a truth deeper than any critique. I never needed their approval. Not then, not ever. What I had always needed, what I had cultivated quietly, deliberately, was my own confidence, my own sense of worth, and my own vision for my life. As I stepped into the cab waiting at the curb, my phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out to see a message from Daniel. "Coffee tomorrow? I'd like to hear more about the mastermind behind tonight." I paused, reading the text carefully. A small grin tugged at my lips. Not because I needed romance, or validation, or anyone else's approval, but because I now had the choice. And for the first time in a long time, I could approach connection on my own terms, without fear, without expectation, and entirely from desire rather than necessity. I typed a quick reply. I'd like that. Tomorrow works. Sliding the phone back into my purse, I settled into the cab seat and exhaled again. The city lights blurred past the window, the hum of traffic like a gentle lullaby. My mind wandered briefly over the night's events, savoring the silence that followed the storm of revelation. The family's stunned expressions, the whispers of astonishment, the subtle admiration from guests. It was all mine to carry, quietly, elegantly, without spectacle. In that moment, I felt a kind of freedom I hadn't known existed. The chains of expectation, comparison, and judgment had fallen away. I had achieved recognition on my own terms, proved my worth without compromise, and walked away with dignity intact. And yet, the future felt open, uncharted, and thrilling. There was no script, no predetermined path, no demand for conformity. The victories of the past were satisfying, but the possibilities ahead, both professional and personal, felt endless. I could choose, create, and live fully, unbound by the weight of other people's assumptions. I allowed myself one last thought before the cab pulled away from the hotel. The outcast bride had transformed, not because of vindication or revenge, but because she had claimed her own power. She had faced years of dismissal and emerged not diminished, but stronger, confident, and unafraid. My phone buzzed once more. Another message from Daniel. Looking forward to it? I smiled again. The warmth of choice, of possibility, and of companionship on my terms filled me with quiet joy. The night felt like the end of a chapter, but the ink was still wet, ready for me to write what came next. And maybe, this time, I'd write my own ending.